Hey, well, I'm back. It's kind of an interesting day yesterday. Not an hour or two after the show stopped, we were downstairs again minding our own business, and all of a sudden things started jostling again. Only this time it was pretty severe, and we knew that it was a much bigger earthquake, probably between 8 and 10 times the size of the previous quake, the 6.4. So the 7.1 that we had yesterday evening was a big one. Not huge, but big. And so, and it was close enough to Ridgecrest to cause a whole dose more damage to them. So they need all the help they can get. But this goes back to that same thing we were talking about when we look at this whole picture. One of the things we talked about earlier was how does this connect to gold and how does it connect to the formation of gold? Well, let's start off with two things we've talked about. Right in here you can see in geology, this is lode from Wikipedia. Okay, so define lode. In geology, a lode is a deposit of metalliferous ores that fills or is embedded in a fissure or crack. Now you begin to get the picture about earthquakes. In a rock formation, it's a vein of ore that's deposited or embedded between layers of rocks. During an earthquake, the motion involved is so violent and so powerful that fissures are opened up and closed, open and closed during the dynamics of the quake movement. Not just where the quake moved, but near it. And I'll show you that in a second. And so what ends up happening is it's kind of like what goes on when we do fracking, okay? And that is you're basically taking forces and fluids that are embedded in the rocks and minerals down below, and you're causing things to form fissures and cracks, and also to move fluids through those fissures and cracks. When those fluids move, they carry with them the metalliferous, that means metal-containing fluids, into a new location, and also pick up new materials that they pass by as they go through. Now that going through is something that doesn't finish with the quake. It continues through the next decades as this material moves through the new fissure. And so what happens is it can form, it can move the material, and it can get more contact with more metalliferous rocks and minerals and leach the metal out of those things. But it can also, because think of it, it's pulverizing that material. It's not just cracking it, it's cracking and crushing, and there's just cracks all over down there now. So now the next thing it's going to do is it's going to also provide a location for this fluid to move into, as well as possibly flash that material. We talked about that earlier. I'll get into that in a second. Flash that water into gas and deposit small crystals of gold to seed that material and cause it to start to plate out. In this particular picture, you can see this pickaxe is sitting on top of a metal lode. It looks kind of crungy. It's really hard to see. It's kind of dirty and messy. But this is a bunch of quartz and other sulfides, so it's very kind of, we'll call it dirt. Reddish, dark colored material on the sides. It looks a little bit like it's whitish here, in places. The color here isn't the greatest rendition, but the basic principle is the same, and that is this was once a fissure that had fluid containing silica and metals, and it moved through it, and then the metals plated out, and eventually the fluids dropped below the pressure and temperature necessary for the crystals of quartz to form, and boom, by that time it locks everything up. But it contains concentrate pockets of gold, and that's the whole idea. And so what you get is a stringer that's mentioned down below here. So when we talk about a stringer, we talk about a lode, basically, that's the rock is permeated by little tiny cracks or veinlets. These cracks or veinlets form in earthquakes. So here we go. And so rather than mining the veins, the entire massive ore is inveined in the country rock. And so the whole country rock gets pulled out. It depends on how fine those veinlets are. So it just depends on how much concentration there is of the gold, how much gold there is in the actual vein itself, and how big the vein is, whether you take it out by pick or whether you open pit kind of thing. And so it's really a function of concentration and ease of access. So that's what happens during the earthquake. Now the other thing that happens is this thing right here, which I thought I'd call your attention to. Here's an article in Smithsonian about earthquakes being basically gold factories. In the cracks, between the tectonic plates. Not quite right. The tectonic plates are sort of causing these forces, but it's not a crack between the plates. It's cracks in the plates. And this stuff gets infused into those cracks that are in each plate. In this case, the continental crust is getting crunched up by the diving Pacific plate, and so those two interact. As this dives under it, it puts metalliferous material up in here through hydrothermal activity, but it also puts tension on this, and then when that tension releases, pop, we get those things we talked about last night with the spring motion, pop, and that causes cracks and fissures to form that are the source of these places where we emplace gold into lode. So that's kind of the picture we're painting with this thing night after night. So I thought I'd take you back over to our other friend here, and that is the earthquake picture, because it's kind of fascinating. It's just hopping. So this is a picture showing us the earthquakes, including last night's 7.1 right here. That was a whopper. Biggest quake I've seen in a long time. It is as big as the Hector quake back in 1999, I think it was. And so it's one of those things that, you know, kind of keeps you rolling as to what's going to happen next, in part because, you know, if you recall, this was the 6.4 right here that started this. Well, it didn't even start there. It started down in here with a 4 point something. It was a pretty small one. And then within an hour or two, you know, this thing exploded free. And so once that happened, then it was a day or so later that we got this thing to go. And now what's happening is all these guys are migrating northward, including clear up. This is Little Lake up in this area. And then beyond that is this area near Coso Junction. Now, why is Coso Junction interesting? Well, if you know anything about the area, right in this area through here, let me draw a line. Let me take this off. Well, let me draw a line through here. Make sure I got the right colors. That's good enough. So right down through this area, right in here, is a whole series of geothermal deposits, geothermal activity. And so what happens is this is right in an area where, you know, if you look right, you'll see, if you look on a map, you'll see a bunch of black, you know, cinder cones and volcanoes right in that area there. So this thing is moved up and kind of buttressed against those volcanoes, and for some strange reason has jumped the mountains to the other side, and it's starting to perk along toward the north. Now, why is that important? Because, well, just north of here was one of the largest earthquakes in California history. You know, we've got several places up here that have had 7.8 earthquakes. That's a big one. That's a really big one. And so when you start getting quakes up in there and they're near population centers, it's disaster. Now, sure, you can get them upwards of 8+ and pushing 9. We've got things like that have happened down in Chile and some over in Japan or off the coast of Japan. But usually you don't find them right in the center of a population area. And in this case, it's not very populated, but there are, you know, places like Ridgecrest or Bishop, you know, that are small towns in the area that could face some pretty serious rumbling. But the other fact is that if we back off from this and we look, so let me clear this out. So now, if you back off, this is the thing I was telling you about. This is the San Andreas, and as you can see, we've had a couple little quakes along here in the last day. 3.4 at Grapevine. That happens to be a place I'm watching, because that's the intercept between the San Andreas and that Garlock Fault, right down through that Grapevine zone, just near Palmdale and near Bakersfield, south of Bakersfield. So it's kind of in between those two. The Palmdale Bakersfield axis there is where the Garlock Fault comes through. And so it's this red line right here, Garlock Fault zone, and as it comes down and it joins the San Andreas here, it has a potential to affect a place that's locked, which is pretty much a zone from about here. Let's see if I can get this right. From about here on up. I can't get it right. On up into that area. And so what happens is, and there is also another section that's locked up down all the way to the Salton Sea. And what they're worried about is unlocking that much zone of earthquake. It would be a huge quake. There isn't enough to unlock all through this to equal about a 9 or so or more, but it's pretty close, maybe 8.7. So, and that's a huge quake, and it would go right between Los Angeles and San Francisco. It'd be a mess. And that's the one we're all kind of dreading. As they've said, just because there's all this quake activity out here doesn't correlate that that would affect over here, other than that if there are zones that are already about ready to go, you know, pushing and shoving a bit is certainly going to add some momentum to the, you know, to the energy that's there, because it's flexing. So it all depends upon whether it's really ready to break free or not. And so we'll know in the next probably week or two. Then after that, there will be a series of quakes in this area for at least a year. That's what we saw in the Northridge quake. It went on for a good year, almost two, where there were, you know, in these next few weeks, you get seasick. You know, it's just pop, 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 pop. It's always going. But that'll be mostly in this area that I outlined in blue here, the circle. The rest of it's kind of not going to be affecting us that much, unless another 7+ comes up, and then it could get interesting. We've already got a fair number of people wishing that the warning centers that sent out a warning in Southern California around Los Angeles earlier, but the reality is they already determined that this level was not going to be damaging to buildings or structures here in Southern California. Now, they have to go out and check every time, but they do that anyway. We don't necessarily need to freak out over it, you know. And so sending out a pager thing that would tell you, hey, you know, you need to watch out for an earthquake. It's interesting. I actually got paged, and so did my wife. She has another app, a different one than I do. On this last series of earthquakes, they sent out information, so we knew something was up. But in both cases, what we found was that it was a foreshock. It was one shock about 2 minutes earlier than the big quake. And so when that foreshock went off, it was big enough to trigger the alarms on our phones and tell us there was something happening. So when it struck, that was interesting, and then it just didn't make sense that there was that much shaking with a 4.5. You see what I mean? Just you would hardly feel it here. And instead, you know, a few minutes later, there was all this, you know, basically the whole app froze up. The USGS was closed for the evening, trying to deal with all the traffic. And then finally the number pops out and went 7.1, then it went 6.9. They got some input from global international geological societies, and then they went back to the USGS's survey, especially the guys down here at Caltech who practically invented the earthquake. and they recorrected it back up. So it can go up as well as down. And that's done typically by the elimination of bad, noisy seismographs or instruments from the equation and corrections that are done. And it takes a lot of power to correct those things. Supercomputers do it now, but it takes, you know, time, and it'll become more accurate over time. And so they're caught between a rock and a hard place. On smaller quakes, it's easy to tweak them, throw them out, nobody cares. But on the big quakes, everybody's watching, and so they try not to be too ambitious too early, you know, because it scares people. So that's kind of it for tonight. I just thought I'd touch on quakes and gold 2. Here we go again, and show you a little bit of what's been going on. It is kind of interesting, like I said, when you go into that area and look at it, there is definitely a pattern to this thing going north to south. And there's also a number of quakes further up around. There's these ones up in Big Pine area. I was watching those last night because of, you know, concerns I have that this would go into this north of Coso here, and there's this Big Pine, and there's a place up near Independence that basically has a history of that, you know, 7.8 or so earthquake. So, you know, when you get something like that, that would be felt down here toward the LA area. Especially one of the things that happens here that people don't realize is that the quake waves are actually moving the earth. The earth is kind of it's floating on fluid, but it is also kind of fluid in the way it's springy, and it also has gaps and soils, you know. So it, depending upon whether it's alluvial or hard rock like bedrock, it may flex more or less. And fluid means these alluvial plains can actually liquefact. Things can sink into them, and that can cause big buildings to fall over. Bad idea. Okay, so what ends up happening with these guys is they also, when they hit hard rock, they reflect. Kind of think of it like waves hitting a marina or a jetty and slamming into it and then echoing back out and causing interference at the entrance to a marina. Well, you can get the same thing up here, echoing off of these two mountain ranges and aiming straight down toward LA. And that's kind of why I think we've been feeling it typically a little bit more than the guys even to the east. Las Vegas is a little closer. They felt this last one, but the first one they sort of felt, we felt pretty strongly. So I think it's just simply a matter of where you are with reflections. And that can vary based on exactly where the quake is, how deep it is, and what obstacles are echoing, and how many echoes it took to get down to. What's the frequency? whether it's a tuned thing. Kind of think of it as like a trumpet or a tuned instrument. You know, if it's tuned to the right frequency, it'll be very loud and you'll be heard a long way away. So that's it for tonight. I just thought I'd touch bases with you again on gold prospecting, and check out this Smithsonian article. There's several others. Just look up earthquakes and gold factories or earthquakes and gold, and you'll find that information. It's relatively new, the concept, about 2013 or so. This is a couple of researchers from Australia who did it, Dean Weatherly and Richard Henley, and basically looked at the Earth's crust and the sea of sand, rock, salt, etc., and what's going on down there to cause the gold to plate out. So it's pretty cool finding. Again, it's hypothesis because it's pretty hard to do experiments to prove this stuff, but they did simulations on computer to kind of give an idea of how it works. So anyway, check that out, and check out that other stuff on Load and Wikipedia, and you kind of get a picture of what we're talking about when we're talking connect the dots between gold and so forth, and earthquakes. There's Prospector Jess, sourdoughminer.com, and again, make sure you check out, with relationship to those gold mines and prospects, check out the GGM report down there, sourdoughminer.com/GGM. Check it out, take a look. It's a report, it's really cheap, and it'll tell you a little bit more about where you can get started to find gold in these locations, in the desert, in the mountains, wherever around the world. Okay, so that's it for tonight. I will catch you later. Good prospecting. Prospector Jess over and out. Making sure I've got this live feed going here. I keep forgetting to check earlier. Sorry about that, guys. Do I know what I'm doing? Yeah, well, sort of. If not, you're gonna follow me, right? Right, guys? Okay, there we are. 20 comments down. If not, you're gonna follow me, right? Right, guys? So we're good. And let's see, gold. What would you do in places that aren't the best? Let's see. Brad Rush says, "I really like the knowledge you give us to find the best gold in the best areas. Thank you for that. Other than the obvious places to find gold, what would you do in places that aren't the best? Let's see, such as Tennessee, etc." Again, one of the things you got to look at when you look at what I teach, one of the things I try to show you is this concept of why. Why is the gold where it is? Why is the gold not where it is? Or better yet, what kind of gold is where? Now, what you find with gold is it's most everywhere. It's the concentration and type of gold that varies. And so typically when people say there's no gold in Nebraska, what they need to be looking for is ultra-fine flour glacial gold. It's going to be hard to find and hard to recover, but it's there. And so the trick is to find places where it tends to concentrate, such as gravel pits and sand bars and so forth, in areas that are drained by places that had and if you can find any place that's near bedrock, that would help. But the problem is that many of these places that are hard to find have to do with alluvium, just like this desert stuff. So in the desert, you don't necessarily look out in the middle of that stuff. You look over on the edges where those mountains are popping through. That's where the gold's going to be concentrating, that you can find it. That doesn't mean there isn't gold down below those fissures and faults. Oh, I'm sure there is, but I'm sure there's also 20 miles of alluvium between you and it, and that's a lot of overburden to remove. You don't want to do that. And that's just a basic principle there, Brad. I just, it's not that I can't go into the gory details on this, but maybe a future tutorial we can talk about that. Hard spots. Let's see, Larry Moore is here. All right, Larry, glad to have you. And Steve Ward, yay, Aussie. So let's see. Andrew DeCousin says thank you, and Bob Sheesley says thank you. Stay safe out there. Yeah, we will. We're kind of, we've been here before and done this. Some people have not, and so it's interesting. You always run into these things, run into people who are newbies when it comes to quakes, and their eyes are big, and there's a lot of questions. Okay, get your gas. Don't go crazy. Get your water. Have ample water for a minimum of 72 hours, 3 days, for all the family members plus dogs and cats. But you really need to have, here's the gotcha. If you're deep into the city, unfortunately, you may need up to 3 weeks of water, and that's something people don't talk about too much. But that's what I was trained to. I had some guys from a search and rescue team out of the fire department here locally. They taught us, look, when a big quake happens, there, as they learned in the Northridge quake, the bridges go down, the roads get clogged with cars that are in gridlock. People abandon their cars and walk home or walk wherever out of the city. Now you've got a bunch of machinery that plugs up all the arteries. And guess what? You're in the center of that. Nobody's going to be able to come and deliver water to you. The water mains are all broken, or they're fouled with sewage because sewage and water breaks at the same time. Gas mains are broken, so they turn off all the gas. So now you have no heating energy, no electricity, no water. What are you going to do? Well, you're camping. You're dry camping. Just make sure you have enough stuff in the initial conditions, especially if you have a little bit of an early warning like we do right now, where, yeah, there's a possibility, as they said, they're waffling out right now between the USGS and Caltech about, there's between a 8 and a 15% probability that there will be a larger quake in the next week from this same series, probably on the same fault. We may or may not feel it significantly. If, on the other hand, it swings down and goes down that Garlock fault and starts attacking toward the San Andreas, it could go very rapidly. As we saw last night, it went very rapidly up north, covered about 20 miles to the north and 20 miles to the south kind of thing in a hurry. And that's what quakes can do. They can go real slow, and all of a sudden they make a breakthrough and they'll run to the next stop point. Well, that's the problem. So you got to be ready for that and prepare your water and your gasoline for your generator, and have enough stuff to keep your refrigerator and freezer cold, and have food and water enough to last you at least 3 days, if not a week or more. And that's just good common sense. And then there's other tricks you can learn about using levers like you do when you move boulders. You can use levers to move concrete off of buildings and people and things like that. Amazing stuff. These guys were, the search and rescue team taught us a bunch of stuff. It was after the Northridge quake, so they had plenty of practice. And they showed us little tricks to how to use 2x4s and form teams in your neighborhood so that you can all go together as a team and have a team captain for your neighborhood. And their job is to have you go out and find in all the rubble usable material that you can use for rescue and for recovery and for things like heat and shelter and stuff like that, so that your neighborhood can come together and survive this thing, because the fire department and the military and everybody else won't be able to get to you for a long time, because those arteries are clogged and all their heavy equipment can't make it through all that steel. So it's an interesting predicament, and it's pretty dire, But that's reality here in Southern California, where you have a fairly sizable area that could be impacted. And that's probably the worst case. In reality, we've seen several of these quakes, and, they managed to not be so dire. But it was bad enough during that one that, things shut down for a week or so. Okay, so that's it for today. Good prospecting. Check out Lode and find out with the government gold maps, find out where you can find some gold near you, placer or lode deposits, or platinum or gold or diamonds, or beryllium or whatever you want, rare earth elements. Map them out and start prospecting. Good prospecting. Prospector Jess, over and out. I'll catch you next time. Good night.